Pam Bondi walked into that federal courtroom with one sheet of paper, and in less than 5 minutes, she cornered Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. No cameras, no reporters, just silence, tension, and a fact so precise it froze the entire chamber. Barrett didn't see it coming. What Bondi exposed raised questions about secret coordination, judicial bias, and something far more dangerous, control. The moment she spoke, the system trembled. And what happened next? No one was prepared for. If you enjoy bold, real-world storytelling like this, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. The courtroom was designed to feel eternal. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, thick carpets that swallowed every footstep. It gave the illusion of permanence, of solemnity, as though the laws written here were immune to time. But on that day, as Pam Bondi took her seat opposite Justice Amy Coney Barrett, nothing felt stable. It was a closed-door federal hearing, part of a quiet inquiry into judicial conduct in the age of algorithmic law. The public wasn't invited. The media hadn't been notified. Even most members of Congress weren't aware it was happening. It was the kind of proceeding that exists to check a box, produce a transcript, and disappear quietly into the archives. No one expected anything unusual, except Pam Bondi. The former Florida Attorney General had been off the radar for months. She hadn't given an interview, appeared on television, or filed a case in over a year. So when she requested to deliver a concluding statement to the Judicial Review Committee, no one raised an eyebrow. She was known as a procedural conservative, not a provocateur, a trusted insider. Safe. But as she rose from her chair and walked toward the central podium with a single sheet of paper in her hand, everything changed. She didn't address the room. She addressed one person. Justice Barrett, she said, voice clear, even, and deliberate. I have here a document submitted under Rule 27. It contains a match report generated by a neutral algorithmic auditor. It identifies a series of linguistic consistencies between your judicial rulings and language found in confidential Department of Justice briefing materials. Barrett's expression didn't change. Her training was too deep, but her stillness spoke volumes. Bondi continued. In 17 separate cases over the past 22 months, your majority opinions feature identical phrasing, structural logic, and lexical patterns to internal DOJ strategy documents never made public. That's not a coincidence, Justice. That's a pattern. The silence was suffocating. Barrett finally responded. The court often draws from a wide array of sources. Correlation does not imply causation. Pam stepped closer. Then deny it. Deny that your rulings borrowed language from documents you had no procedural access to. Barrett didn't move. One of the aides shifted awkwardly. A clerk coughed. The chair of the review committee looked as though she wanted to intervene, but the weight of Bondi's words kept her frozen. Pam placed the paper gently on the table. This is the one fact. Not a theory. Not a hunch. It's math. And if it's true, it means the highest court in this country has been compromised. Not through money or scandal, but through language. Through quiet, invisible influence. Barrett stared at the page. She didn't pick it up. She didn't have to, because everyone in that room knew what had just happened. The myth of judicial isolation had cracked. And outside that silent chamber, the storm was already forming. The door shut behind Amy Coney Barrett with a soft but definitive click. Inside the courtroom, silence lingered like a fog. The review committee remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Not out of protocol, but paralysis. No one quite knew what had just happened, only that something irreversible had begun. Bondi remained seated, calm, composed, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the ripple she sent through that sealed chamber was already racing outward, unstoppable. Outside the judiciary, the first domino fell quietly. A clerk's assistant, one of the few present in the room, shared a cryptic message on an encrypted forum used by legal professionals. Just 5 words. Bondi dropped a judicial bomb. Within hours, speculation lit up across legal and intelligence circles. Though the hearing had been off-record and sealed, the fact that it even occurred raised alarms. Bondi's known absence from public life, her sudden appearance, and her surgical accusation had all the hallmarks of a calculated operation. Inside Barrett's chambers, damage control began. Her senior clerks circled the wagons. They quickly scrubbed internal memos, redirected correspondence, and began crafting a public-facing statement. But there was a problem. They didn't know what Bondi had actually released. They had only seen the single page. And Bondi wasn't waiting for them to catch up. She quietly forwarded the full linguistic audit, redacted for security reasons, to 3 independent legal ethics watchdogs, a cybersecurity nonprofit, and a single investigative journalist with a track record of exposing high-level corruption. Each recipient received the file with the same subject line: the one fact. By the following morning, early versions of the audit began circulating among academic and legal experts. It wasn't sensational. It didn't need to be. It was clinical, objective, and devastating. Phrases like statistical anomaly, recurrent structuring, and multi-source origin alignment appeared again and again. Translations for laypeople followed quickly. Barrett's rulings had mirrored classified DOJ phrasing with such frequency and precision that the odds of it occurring by coincidence were near zero. Barrett released a formal response. The Supreme Court draws from legal scholarship, government briefs, and a range of internal and external sources. To suggest intentional coordination based on phrasing ignores the complexity of modern jurisprudence. But it wasn't enough, because Bondi didn't need to prove intent. She had already proven access. And access to pre-publication DOJ material meant someone was leaking to the court, or the court was reaching into executive files behind closed doors. Both options were nuclear. And Bondi, she still hadn't said a word to the media. The file had been in the wild for just 36 hours, but already it was being dissected like a crime scene. Legal analysts, code auditors, civil liberties watchdogs, all of them picked apart the data with surgical precision. What started as a whisper in one courtroom had become the loudest noise in the legal world. And in that chaos, one word began to emerge again and again: pattern. The audit Bondi released was no ordinary document. It contained forensic linguistic modeling, a kind of fingerprint analysis that mapped not just words but structure, cadence, and tone. Each data point on its own seemed trivial, but taken together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Supreme Court rulings authored or co-authored by Barrett shared uncanny structural similarities with policy frameworks from the Department of Justice and, more alarmingly, with briefing papers from defense contractors and AI policy consultants. Then came the second wave. A whistleblower from within the DOJ leaked metadata logs to a transparency watchdog site. The logs showed access timestamps that aligned almost perfectly with the creation dates of Barrett's rulings. The files hadn't just inspired her legal writing, they had preceded it. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about shared language. It was about timing. It was about access. Pam Bondi, still silent publicly, began forwarding supplemental data packages to key senators, known reformers in the Judiciary Committee, and one unexpected recipient, the Inspector General of the United States. In a city built on deniability, Bondi was eliminating every shadow. Barrett's team scrambled. Behind closed doors, her communications were locked down. Her clerkship program was put on pause. Law professors previously loyal to her began distancing themselves, citing personal uncertainty and the need for transparency. Anonymous sources in the judiciary reported late-night calls from Barrett to fellow justices. But no statement could match the velocity of the data. It wasn't just Washington watching anymore. Legal institutions around the world began reviewing their own judicial language for overlap. In London, a peer-reviewed journal published a bombshell editorial questioning whether algorithmic convergence was affecting high courts globally. Within days, an encrypted video surfaced. It was short, grainy, but authentic. In it, a man with his face obscured explained how language packages were being distributed quietly to key judicial contacts under the guise of informational alignment. The implication was shocking. Barrett may not have written these phrases knowingly. The system may have evolved around her, using subtle influence disguised as helpful input. Was Barrett a co-conspirator, or was she merely a vessel? That question began dividing the legal world. And Bondi, she let the debate rage. Because the moment you have to ask whether the highest court in the country is operating independently, you've already lost trust. And that, she knew, was the real pressure point. It came not through a press conference, not through a whistleblower's prepared statement, but through a flickering, 14-second clip uploaded anonymously to a secure, blockchain-verified node in the decentralized legal network. The file was called directive_summit42.mp4. The content: blurry video, captured from behind a pillar in what appeared to be a resort conference room. The audio was muffled, distorted by distance and poor equipment, but the voice was unmistakable. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and she was speaking with remarkable clarity. We need to begin seeding interpretive language now, before the AI governance framework fractures across jurisdictions. Precedent only works if we ensure consistency before the crisis hits. She wasn't alone. In the frame, partially visible, sat 3 other individuals. One was identified by voice as a senior DOJ official. The others, through crowdsourced research, were determined to be executives from a top-tier AI defense contractor and a federal judiciary ethics advisor. The setting matched a luxury judicial policy summit held 18 months prior, an off-the-record event not listed on any official calendar. The implications were immediate and catastrophic. Barrett was not just receiving language. She was discussing the insertion of it, proactively, strategically. Within hours, the video was everywhere. Legal subreddits dissected the clip frame by frame. Think tanks began releasing emergency statements. Even Barrett's usual defenders in conservative legal circles couldn't ignore what was now playing in high definition across encrypted networks, legal forums, and even mainstream media platforms. Barrett's chambers released a statement calling the video heavily edited and taken out of context. But the original file, uncut and time-stamped, had already been verified by 3 separate cybersecurity firms. And then, almost immediately, the retaliation began. Pam Bondi's communications were targeted. Her encrypted server was hit by a sophisticated breach attempt traced to a subnet used by a federal contractor. Her legal research team reported surveillance drones outside one of their private research facilities. Her home internet was severed 3 times in 1 week. But Bondi didn't flinch. She went old school. Paper records, physical couriers, face-to-face meetings. She even began moving her operations to a secure location in Montana, supported by a network of civil liberties attorneys, ex-prosecutors, and former federal agents disillusioned by what they called the quiet coup. Meanwhile, inside the court, tension was fracturing unity. 2 justices allegedly confronted Barrett in private chambers, demanding an explanation. One clerk anonymously leaked that internal memos had begun circulating, not about how to handle Bondi's claims, but how to protect the institution from a collapse of public faith. Bondi remained silent until she appeared, unexpectedly, at a symposium hosted by the Independent Bar Review Coalition. She took the podium, without notes, and delivered only one line. If a single justice can shape the future using secret words from invisible hands, then the Constitution is no longer written in ink, it's written in code. The room erupted, not with applause, but with realization. This was no longer about one opinion, or one case. This was systemic. Barrett's name began appearing in digital art, protest posters, and editorial cartoons. Half portrayed her as a villain. The other half, as a prisoner of a machine far larger than herself. Bondi knew the machine wasn't just the court. It was the entire unseen layer beneath the system. The consultants, the policy writers, the data miners, the soft power brokers. But she wasn't finished. The summit clip had opened the door. Next, she would walk the public straight through it. Pam Bondi's team called it procedural filing. But what she submitted to the Office of Judicial Conduct was anything but ordinary. It was a full-blown petition for a formal ethics investigation into Justice Amy Coney Barrett, citing undisclosed reliance on non-public executive communications and potential pre-ruling coordination with third-party actors. In legal terms, it was a nuclear move. No one had ever filed such a claim against a sitting Supreme Court justice without a scandal involving money, sex, or blatant corruption. Bondi's weapon wasn't scandal. It was structure, influence, invisible machinery dressed in procedural robes. The petition was over 200 pages long, accompanied by affidavits, linguistic studies, and digital chain of custody certifications. It read less like a complaint and more like an indictment against the entire process of how modern rulings were being shaped in secret. The political world erupted. Cable news ran wall-to-wall coverage. Legal blogs exploded with analysis. Senate Judiciary Committee members were cornered by journalists on Capitol Hill, forced to address what one reporter dubbed the Barrett Protocol. Barrett supporters called the petition outrageous, unprecedented, and a dangerous breach of judicial independence. But privately, even conservative clerks admitted the filing was airtight, methodical, relentless. There was no character attack, only data, procedure, and damning pattern recognition. For the first time in modern memory, the phrase judicial firewall started trending. Bondi had forced a national debate. Should Supreme Court justices be held accountable for algorithmic alignment and covert influence, even if no law was technically broken? Meanwhile, Bondi made a strategic pivot. She withdrew from the media spotlight and allowed her documentation to circulate freely. Academics, law schools, and think tanks received packages containing redacted datasets, deposition summaries, and video timelines. It was a public release of evidence, one that couldn't be twisted or suppressed. Then came the unexpected moment. Bondi appeared in a live stream, brief and direct. She held up the same sheet of paper from the courtroom confrontation, now framed. "This," she said, "is the one fact that forced the conversation. Not because it was explosive, but because it was verifiable. The system didn't collapse because of scandal. It cracked because someone finally followed the code." Her words hit harder than any accusation, because what she had done was no longer about Barrett. It was about the architecture. And now, the entire country was looking at the blueprint. For a full week, Washington stood on a knife's edge. The Bondi petition, the leaked video, and the linguistic analysis were still rippling outward, crashing through walls that had stood untouched for decades. Inside the court, Barrett kept working, quietly, distantly. But something had shifted. She no longer authored majority opinions. Her clerks issued brief summaries on her behalf. She stopped attending external legal conferences. Her silence was no longer strategic. It was a shield. But outside that building, the system was already beginning to transform. Several federal judges, unconnected to the Supreme Court, issued public statements calling for increased transparency in judicial drafting processes. One mid-level appellate judge went so far as to suggest an external audit mechanism for all federal rulings involving AI-related cases. That idea had once been unthinkable. Now is gaining traction. A team of constitutional law scholars published a white paper titled "Precedent Under Pressure: Covert Influence and the Breakdown of Judicial Neutrality." In it, they cited Bondi's evidence extensively. The paper circulated through Congress. Staffers added its language to internal memos. And then, suddenly, shockingly, a resolution was introduced to form a bipartisan commission on AI and judicial ethics. This was no longer theoretical. Meanwhile, protests outside federal courts increased. They weren't massive, but they were persistent. Groups of law students, professors, former prosecutors, and even retired judges held signs that read, "No ghostwriters. No ghost rulings." A new movement was emerging. Not radical, but resolute. They didn't want to dismantle the court. They wanted to decode it. And still, Bondi stayed silent. Until one night, during a closed-door roundtable hosted by Civil Liberties Organization, she reappeared. The meeting wasn't supposed to be filmed, but someone recorded it. And when the footage surfaced, it went viral in minutes. "If we accept rulings shaped by invisible hands," Bondi said, "then democracy becomes performance. Law becomes theater, and truth becomes irrelevant." It was the kind of statement that couldn't be unheard. The next day, two senior congressional leaders called for an inquiry not into Barrett, but into the system of language sharing between government agencies and the judiciary. That shift was seismic. For the first time, the lens zoomed out. The story was no longer just about one justice. It was about how power operated in the shadows, regardless of party, ideology, or intent. And then came the quiet confirmation. A cybersecurity firm released a report confirming that predictive text modules, designed by a federal contractor, had been found embedded in software used by clerks in multiple federal courts. Not spyware, not malware, just assistance algorithms. Tools meant to help. Tools that could suggest, complete, or subtly nudge a legal argument. Barrett was never mentioned in the report. She didn't need to be, because now the country had seen the machinery. Bondi had cracked it open. It didn't happen in one explosive moment. No dramatic ruling. No forced resignation. Just silence. A heavy, deliberate silence that spoke louder than any denial. Justice Amy Coney Barrett stopped writing. Her name faded from majority opinions, replaced by generic summaries or bylines from other justices. Her chambers issued only the most essential statements, each one colder and more clinical than the last. The court didn't collapse, but it changed. Suddenly, every ruling was scrutinized through a new lens. Every phrase dissected. Public trust had been cracked, and the public refused to look away. That one fact, Bondi's single page, had reshaped how the nation viewed its most sacred legal institution. Barrett remained in her seat. Constitutionally, she could, but her influence waned. Her voice, once commanding in the legal arena, now hovered in a gray zone of suspicion and discomfort. She wasn't disgraced. She was disarmed. Pam Bondi didn't celebrate. She issued no victory speech. She quietly returned to her legal practice, leaving behind the spotlight and letting the evidence speak for itself. But what she set in motion could not be reversed. Universities rewrote judicial ethics syllabi. Federal courts adopted new policies requiring transparency in drafting assistance tools. Software used by court clerks was overhauled, stripped of predictive features, and rebuilt from open-source code. Judicial integrity commissions formed in 5 states within a month. Bondi had not just exposed a breach. She'd introduced a new standard. And then, in the closing weeks of the controversy, a single essay was published under her name. It appeared in a peer-reviewed law journal, nearly 12,000 words long. Its title, The Language of Power, When Influence Rewrites the Law. In it, Bondi argued not just for judicial transparency, but for a fundamental reimagining of how legal systems engage with language itself in the age of artificial intelligence. The greatest threat to democracy, she wrote, is not disinformation. It's disorientation, the quiet manipulation of trusted systems until they say what they were never meant to say. The essay spread like wildfire across law schools, political think tanks, even international legal bodies. And with it, Bondi's mission was complete. She had restored something the system had forgotten. Accountability, not through vengeance, but through clarity. In the end, it was never about taking down a judge. It was about confronting a truth no one wanted to see. That our systems, no matter how sacred, are only as incorruptible as the silence we accept around them. And one woman, armed with one fact, decided not to stay silent. The page she placed on the table that day didn't just challenge Amy Coney Barrett. It challenged the illusion. And once illusions break, they don't return. They evolve into something more transparent, more cautious, and perhaps more honest. Pam Bondi never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She simply told the truth. And that, in the end, was enough to change everything.